Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, 5 days after Myanmar's deadly earthquake, rescue turns to recovery.
We've already taken 3 dead people out of this building, and we've got another one that we're trying to get out. And under there are 3 women who are still alive.
Now, a country enmeshed in civil war asks, how do you recover from a natural disaster in the middle of a man-made one? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. Around the city of Mandalay, just kilometers from the earthquake's epicenter, piles of rubble fill the streets.
Of course we need help, because many places are damaged, so we need help with everything.
My ribs hurt, and my sister had an injured wrist. My niece, who's 11 and a 5th grader, was in the bathroom when the earthquake struck. She didn't survive. She was the only child in the family.
What were homes, businesses, schools, and even hospitals now bury the people who spent their lives there. With temperatures hitting 40 degrees Celsius, the smell penetrates the air.
Myanmar's second city is now full of precariously twisted buildings, leaning over dangerously, just one brief aftershock from complete collapse.
A team of Chinese rescue workers aren't ready to give up, though. They're hard at work at the Sky Villa condominium complex where a child is trapped. Time is not on their side. It's been more than 60 hours. After 72 hours, rescue turns to recovery, and it gets harder to imagine that the buried are still alive. As they work, the aftershocks continue, and more structures fall. But at 5:37 a.m. local time, with the help of audio and video equipment and a very rare luxury, an excavator, the boy is pulled from the rubble. His legs kick in the air, and his arms grasp for his rescuer. He is alive. There are rare and dwindling signs of hope, says Bob Kitchen. Bob's on the phone with his International Rescue Committee team there every day, several times a day.
I'm Bob Kitchen. I'm the Vice President of Emergencies for the IRC. I've worked for the International Rescue Committee for 23 years now. So I feel very proud of our history and what we've been able to do over the years.
Bob, what were your first thoughts when you heard about the earthquake in Myanmar on Friday?
Well, my first thought was that it is a country that has seen great violence and instability for a very long time. It's a country that is now engulfed in conflict across the country. The government controls about 1/3 of the country. The rest is controlled by what are called popular defense forces, so armed opposition groups. And my first thought was, this is just layering suffering on top of violence. And I can't believe that people have to go through this as well as everything else.
Yeah, okay. So maybe we can start with some basic details. Can you just tell us when and where this happened, how many people were affected, and maybe just how hard it is to just get information with staff there?
Well, that's the first part of the answer, that with a natural disaster like an earthquake impacting a country like Myanmar, getting data is very difficult because it affects the communication system, the major infrastructure. So distinct from a large movement of people because of a war where we normally have a really good handle, people flood across an international border, we count them as they arrive. In a natural disaster, there's actually a whole industry of modeling based on the immediate numbers and how that will translate over time based on the initial scale. So what we know is that there was a 7.7 earthquake that happened on the afternoon of March 28th. That's a really big earthquake. It was felt as far away as Bangkok in Thailand, which is a long way away. Major infrastructure came down. Their lives were lost. So you can only imagine the impact that it had in rural Myanmar, where the infrastructure is very weak. Data is coming out slowly, but we anticipate that tens of thousands of people will have lost their homes, and then many hundreds of thousands will have been otherwise impacted.
Is this purely due to the size of the earthquake, 7.7, or does it also have to do with the types of buildings and the area that it hit?
So within a disaster like this, it's always about the risk being realized and then the vulnerability that it finds. Myanmar is a country that has struggled for a long time. They do have developed infrastructure, particularly in the capital, but from there on out, these infrastructure were really prone to earthquakes, and we've seen that. Teams are sending me pictures of houses that they've just lost their ground floor. They've just collapsed down on themselves. There's no rebuilding those. Lives have been lost as a result of those collapses.
You're in constant contact with your team. Can you take me inside one of those calls, what they sound like, what the priorities are, what the feedback is?
Yeah, so I'm really fortunate that we have a team leader on the ground who's a seasoned emergency expert. He understands how to set up a response in a nimble and responsive way to the needs of the people on the ground. So the first call I had with him was, do we know where all of our people are? Are they okay? We're fortunate none of our staff were injured or impacted. The next question is, where is it impacted? How many people are we dealing with? What level of destruction? How many lives have been lost? And can we get access to those locations? And the answer to that question is yes and no in a place like Myanmar, where getting access to areas controlled by the armed opposition is very difficult. We're fortunate in some ways. It's a strange logic, but we can get to Mandalay, this big city. So our first team went out there, first mobile medical team went to Mandalay to start delivering assistance. So the conversations are, who have we got? How quickly can they get in a car? Are the roads okay? Can we get them safely up there? Is there accommodation? Do we have stocks of humanitarian relief that we can send up there? And then finally, really sundry things like, are there any trucks to be had? Can we rent trucks to get the supplies up there?
Those teams have a huge amount of institutional knowledge. That's because you've had people in the country since 2008. Now, there were already 20 million people needing humanitarian assistance and more than 3 million displaced. And now this happens, displacing even more people. It's like a crisis that's been dropped on top of another crisis.
We're really fortunate to have a team that is so experienced, so plugged into local communities and local partners. You were talking about having a team that's experienced working in conflict, but the actual catalyst that took us to Myanmar in 2008, that gave us permission to get into Myanmar, was Cyclone Nargis. In 2008, Cyclone Nargis did change the terrain in Myanmar in multiple ways. It was a huge disaster that affected millions of people. Millions of communities were flooded and inaccessible. What it also changed was that the government at the time, in the same way as they're doing now, invited in foreign assistance. So we were able to go in, like a handful of other international NGOs, and really make a difference. Our team were rowing around the countryside in little canoes with mobile medical team kits loaded up as high as they dare to reach these isolated communities to try and save lives. And we've stayed there since. During the good times and mostly during the bad times for communities across the country.
Can you give me a little more sense of what things are like on the ground? I mean, people sleeping outside, how the hospitals are handling things. I mean, just how ill-equipped the government is to handle this rush. I mean, most governments would be ill-equipped. I mean, it's just too many people.
I was just going to say, this is not specific to the government in Yangon. This is any government facing a disaster of this size, especially those with weaker infrastructure. We're seeing what we anticipate and have experienced seeing in many other places. Hospitals were extremely busy. Things are starting to settle, but what's more concerning is outside of the major urban areas where people are going to small clinics that were understaffed and under-resourced before this happened, and they're basically out of stock. So one of the things we're doing is rushing additional supplies to those clinics to help them keep their doors open, and then layering on top mobile clinics that go out to the communities to find where people are in need and serve them where they are. Because they've been the mainstay of the international community's response to save lives, and they're just not there now.
There are rescue teams and recovery teams from China. There are others from India, Singapore, Thailand, Russia, all over. The U.S. is sending money, but USAID is effectively gone. I wonder how this new aid landscape, just in the past few months, changes what's possible for the people you're trying to help.
It's a sea change. In the decades I've been in this industry, within an environment like Myanmar right now, where they've had a rapid onset natural disaster, the first things that we would expect would be a team from the US government arriving, a search and rescue team, and then what's called a disaster assistance and recovery team who coordinates the response. And then shortly thereafter, huge military planes airlifting in commodities that save lives. None of that has happened now because all of the infrastructure have been pulled down. So US aid has basically been mothballed. There are plans in place to have what's going to be called a Humanitarian Assistance Bureau, who would be the first line of defense or response to this type of disaster. But even though there's some stuff, there's no systems, there's no plans, there's nothing. So they're completely absent, which is so sad.
Where will you see that most immediately? And will it be in terms of like the heavy equipment as this moves into a total recovery effort?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing we'll miss is a large influx of funds to enable the government, local civil society, and organizations like the IRC to actually respond and make a difference. The US government has historically been a huge funder of water and sanitation programs, of health programs, of shelter programs. That huge amount of money is gone. And then, as you say, heavy debris clearance equipment will be missed. The search and rescue teams, who are some of the best in the world, will be missed. It's a massive contribution that's just gone.
Yeah. I wonder if this is a test case for the Chinese as well. There was some talk when USAID effectively shut down that China would fill some of that void, considering the close relationship with Myanmar. If that doesn't happen here in a significant way, will that be a signal of things to come in terms of Chinese involvement in aid worldwide?
I think the answer to that is yes, and it won't just be the Chinese. We're seeing lots of other governments stepping in to crises in ways that are positive and not so positive because of this vacuum that's been left. In this instance in Myanmar, I think it's broadly positive. The Chinese have a wealth of experience because of their own disasters that they've seen over the years. They have highly trained and very experienced search and rescue teams. They have a lot of heavy equipment. So I think it's good that they've stepped in right now.
Wow, so that's good that the Chinese are stepping up, but for this to happen right as the USAID stuff happens, it's really like three crises. It's the civil war, an earthquake, and then one of the first natural disasters in the post-USAID era. And the people of central Myanmar are just stuck right in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. The IRC had a large grant from the US government that we were implementing in Myanmar. Sadly, it was one of the awards that were cancelled. So we don't even have a base to build from. We're on real rhyme or reason.
We'll have more from Myanmar after the break. Al Jazeera's correspondent Tony Chang was in Myanmar's capital, Naypyidaw, just as the earthquake struck.
A very lucky escape as a column of brick and plaster falls crashing to the ground. This was the moment the earthquake hit, 12:51 p.m. local time. We'd been filming with Myanmar's Deputy Minister of Information as the building rocked, roof tiles falling in, and everyone raced to get outside.
But hours earlier, he'd been at a military parade held by the head of the junta. In the crowd were invited officials from Russia and Belarus. It was quite a grand affair, or at least it appeared to be.
Despite the show of manpower and military might, the reality on the ground is very different. Myanmar's military is being pushed back on all of its fronts. It's estimated they now control only 32% of the country.
There have been some reports, Bob, that the junta is continuing to fight, possibly taking advantage of the chaos to gain back some of the ground that it's lost as you and other organizations kind of struggle to get aid into the country. Are you concerned that this might actually end up accelerating the fighting? And what would that mean for your staff and the people you're trying to help?
Yeah, any war with front lines and ongoing conflict makes responding way more difficult. That has especially been true in Myanmar. We have essentially been working within the government-controlled territory as best we can, and then seeing how we can be helpful in the territories that they don't control. I think this is a shock, not just to the infrastructure and the civilian communities, but I think it is a possible catalyst for change within the conflict itself. Too soon to tell which way. I can confirm that conflict has continued. Fighting hostilities have continued over the last 4 days, which has made accessing vulnerable populations, delivering aid more complex. And it's disappointing to see. This is not the time to take territory. It's the time to save lives of citizens.
How do the affected areas correspond to the battlefield? It seems like this almost was fortunate that the epicenter happened in the very small part of the country that the government still controls.
Well, so the epicenter was in Mandalay, which is government controlled, but the next most heavily hit city, it's kind of on the line there, is Sagaing, which is contested. Neither party control it clearly, and that's one of the areas where we are working with a group of local organizations to see how we can get aid in, and it's complex, I can tell you that.
Is this a situation where in the government-controlled areas you at least know what's happening, but right across the battlefield, you just have no idea whether or not there's any sort of response?
I think that's an accurate description, but not defined only because of front lines and the conflict dynamic. It's also infrastructure. Roads are down, communication links are down. Where we've had pretty good communication across the country, it's really compromised now.
Yeah, are there issues with cellular service, like where there's just certain areas that are just total black holes?
The systems are overwhelmed. People are trying to be in touch with their loved ones across the country. And then there's a national community, humanitarian community, that's trying to coordinate a response. It's overwhelming, a system that's been significantly damaged. So it's not easy to get through to people right now.
We haven't talked at all about the heat and how that compounds everything. And it actually extends the risk time period, doesn't it?
It does. So we've been talking about emergencies and crises on top of each other. There's a longitudinal dynamic here of a second wave of crisis. First wave being the earthquake, the immediate injuries, but then even small cuts and bruises, if left untreated, will turn into infections. If water isn't secured and transported and stored safely, people will get sick. People with non-communicable diseases, high blood pressure, sugar, diabetes, if we don't get the pharmaceutical supply lines back up and running, if we don't get the hospitals, sick people are going to get sicker. So there are follow-on waves of threat to life and illness that's going to come unless we get this response up and running.
And is that something that compounds on one another? Like the more people get sick, the more people get sick, and suddenly you can't get your hands around this.
For sure. It just backs up and people get more sick, and there's people who are passing away because of preventable illness.
Bob, a disaster like this would put strain on any government, but this is no normal government, right? It's been barely clinging to power under the weight of armed opposition from all sides. We've seen how natural disasters can help facilitate the downfall of weak governments in the past. I mean, Syria comes to mind. There was that devastating earthquake there in 2023. This is a stress test for Myanmar. Do you see it as a potentially existential test for this government?
Yeah, I mean, your question is the right question to ask, but falls outside of my expertise. I'm the guy that surges drugs and clinicians in to help save people's lives. What I would say is this type of shock will exacerbate the underlying frustration people have towards their government or non-government parties that are in control. It puts huge pressure on whoever is in charge to deliver services to people who need it really urgently. And either side of the front line, both parties to the conflict are going to really struggle. So that could change the dynamic. But as I said, I'm better at digging holes than I am analyzing politics.
Finally, it seems like we're in this period where a lot of governments are deprioritizing the need for aid. Is there anything that you'd like to say, anything about this particular tragedy that should disabuse those governments of that impulse?
I mean, there's reviews happening around the world at the moment about how governments contribute to international development, international aid. I would say this is a great example of where populations are asking their government what they're doing to help. There's legitimate questions about what money should be spent where, but this is not one of those questions. This is where international solidarity, this is where international funding saves lives. And it does so because all of our families, all of our towns and communities, if something bad happened, we would want other countries to help us. This is how we live together in a peaceful world. When something bad happens, we help each other. So in amongst all the prioritization, I suppose my plea is keep an eye on these big emergencies, and this is where we need to help each other.
Okay. Bob Kitchen, thank you for coming on The Take.
My pleasure.
And that's The Take. Let us know what you want to hear on The Take. What's happening where you are, or what's in your news feed? Go ahead and write a comment below. We always read them, and we do want to know what's on your mind. So let us know. We'll be back tomorrow.